In the span of a single year, I went from a wife to a widow to a ghost. My husband didn't die, you see. He just decided I had. He survived stage 3 lymphoma because I sold our life to pay for his. 3 weeks after the doctors called it a miracle, he called a lawyer. He told me he wanted a real woman, not the worn-out shell I'd become sitting by his bedside. Then he took what little we had left, turned our children against me, and left me in a roadside motel with nothing but the echo of his laughter. He thought he'd erased me. But he made one mistake. He forgot that sometimes, when you bury someone alive, they learn to claw their way out of the dirt. And they come back for you. If you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever been told you were nothing after you gave everything, then you know the fire I'm talking about. It's a cold fire, one that burns slow and quiet. Stick around, and I'll tell you how I learned to use it to burn an entire empire to the ground. And if this story resonates with that quiet, unbreakable part of you, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. It helps to know you're not alone in the dark. Part 1, The Anatomy of a Collapse, Revised. It began with a cough. A small thing, an inconvenience for a man like my husband, Michael. He moved through the world like a force of nature, the self-made CEO of Hale Innovations, a man who saw illness as a personal failing. But the cough clung to him, and soon it was joined by night sweats and a bone-deep weariness he couldn't hide. Our life, once a predictable rhythm of success and comfort, began to fracture. The diagnosis, stage 3 lymphoma, was a bomb that detonated in the quiet of a doctor's sterile office. The invincible man I had loved for 25 years went pale, and his hand found mine, his grip so tight it hurt. In that moment, the world dissolved. There was no past, no future. There was only him, and one singular, all-consuming thought: I had to save him. And so, I began to dismantle our life. It wasn't a single decision, but 1,000 small surrenders. The savings account we'd named our someday fund was gone in a month, swallowed by treatments insurance deemed experimental. I sold my car, telling myself it was practical since we were always at the hospital anyway. Then came our home, the beautiful house where the ghosts of our children's laughter still echoed in the hallways. I smiled at the realtor and signed the papers, feeling nothing. I was a general waging a war, and these were logistical sacrifices, necessary for victory. I became a creature of hospital corridors and 3 a.m. vigils. I learned to read the subtle language of beeping machines and the practiced neutrality in a nurse's voice. My own reflection became a stranger, a gaunt woman with hollowed-out eyes and hair that was rapidly turning gray. The final sacrifice was the most symbolic. I stood in a pawn shop, the air thick with desperation, and slid my wedding ring across the counter. The simple platinum band that had represented a lifetime of promises. The man gave me cash, and I walked out, my hand feeling unnaturally light. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury, and I had long since sold them off. And it worked. After 8 hellish months, the war was won. The scans were clear. The word remission hung in the air like a prayer answered. Michael, thin and frail but with the old fire back in his eyes, gripped my hand. "We did it, Becca," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You saved me." I finally let myself break then, sobbing with a relief so profound it felt like its own kind of pain. We had survived. 3 weeks later, I came home from the grocery store to find him sitting at our small dining table. He was dressed in a crisp shirt and trousers, looking stronger than he had in a year. He looked healthy. He looked like a stranger. "We need to talk," he said, his voice flat. A cold dread, colder than any fear I'd felt during his illness, coiled in my stomach. He didn't waste time. "I filed for divorce." The words didn't compute. I thought it was the lingering effects of the chemo, a morbid joke. But then he looked at me. Really looked at me. His gaze wasn't that of a husband or a partner. It was an appraisal. He took in my tired face, my sensible clothes, the worn-out woman who had poured her life force into him. And then he smirked. It was a small, vile twitch of his lips that shattered me. "I got a second chance at life, Rebecca," he said, his voice dripping with condescending pity. I'm not going to waste it being tethered to a reminder of the worst year of my life. He stood and walked to the window, his back to me. I want to live again. I want passion, excitement. He turned, and his eyes were like chips of ice. I want a real woman now. Someone vibrant. Someone who didn't get old and worn out while I was sick. The cruelty was breathtaking. He had weaponized my sacrifice, turning the very love that saved him into the reason for my disposal. The weeks that followed were a systematic demolition. He argued in court that since our assets were sold for his care, the remaining cash was a marital asset. He took half. Then he turned on the children. He fed them a carefully crafted story of my mental instability, my breakdown under the stress. He was the calm, rational father, worried for his hysterical wife. And they believed him. Mark, my son, told me I sounded unhinged and that he needed to protect his father's recovery from my negativity. Jessica, my daughter, just cried, her loyalty fractured, before her calls grew infrequent and then stopped entirely. He took everything. Not just the money, not just the life we had built, but the very people I had built it for. I landed in a cheap motel on the highway, a place that smelled of stale cigarettes and despair. At 47, I was a ghost haunting a life that was no longer mine. Every night, I'd lie on the lumpy mattress and stare at the cracked ceiling, the image of his smirk burned onto the back of my eyelids. He hadn't just left me. He had declared me dead. He just hadn't bothered to bury the body. I had nothing. No hope, no future, nothing left to lose. I was at the bottom of the world, and I didn't know that someone was about to hand me a shovel. Part 2, the sound of a key turning in a lock. The motel room wasn't just a place, it was a state of being. The air was a thick cocktail of stale smoke, industrial cleaner, and the faint, sweet smell of decay coming from the stained carpet. It was the smell of hopelessness. For 6 weeks, I breathed it in until I felt it coating my lungs. My days were formless, marked only by the sun's slow crawl across the grimy windowpane. I'd try to call my children. Mark's number soon went to a curt, pre-recorded message. The number you have dialed has been changed. He had cut the final thread. Jessica would answer, her voice a hesitant whisper, filtered through a fog of her father's lies. He's taking me and some friends to the lake house this weekend, she'd say, a forced cheerfulness in her tone. The lake house we'd sold to pay for his treatment. He must have bought it back. He seems so much better, Mom. So happy. Each word was a tiny, sharp pebble thrown against the fragile glass of my sanity. I was becoming the person he described, a ghost, haunting the edges of a life that had moved on without me. My savings were almost gone. Soon I wouldn't even have this miserable room. I'd be on the street. The thought wasn't terrifying, it was just numb. It was the logical conclusion to my erasure. And then, on a Tuesday night so unremarkable it was identical to all the others, the knock came. It was a soft, discreet thump-thump. Not the impatient rap of the manager or the drunken fumbling of a lost guest. It was deliberate. My heart, a sluggish muscle that had forgotten how to race, gave a painful lurch. Paranoia, my only constant companion, whispered in my ear. It's him. He's come to finish the job. I crept to the door, my breath held tight in my chest, and peered through the peephole. The distorted fisheye lens showed nothing but the sickly yellow light and the peeling paint of the opposite wall. I waited, listening. Silence. Finally, I slid the security chain and opened the door a crack. And there it was. A small, plain cardboard box on the threadbare welcome mat. No stamps, no address, no name. It hadn't been mailed, it had been placed. My mind raced. A final, cruel joke from Michael? A box of my old things he'd found in the trash. With a trembling hand, I snatched it from the hallway, locked and bolted the door, and carried it back to the bed as if it were a bomb. It felt strangely light. For a full 5 minutes, I just stared at it, the brown cardboard an alien object in my monochrome world. Finally, a desperate curiosity won out. My fingers, clumsy with a fear I hadn't felt in weeks, tore at the tape. Inside, nestled on a bed of plain white tissue paper, were two things. A small, black flash drive, and a single, folded piece of heavy, expensive-feeling paper. I picked up the note first. I unfolded it. 6 words were typed in a clean, impersonal font. "He's not who you think he is." And below that, a command that made the hairs on my arms stand up. "Finish what he started." The words were an enigma. Finish what he started? Our divorce? His recovery? It was nonsense. But the first line. "He's not who you think he is." A cold wave washed over me. I knew that already. The man who smirked while he destroyed my life was not the man I'd married. But the note implied something more. A secret buried deeper than infidelity and cruelty. My eyes fell to the flash drive. It sat there, inert but pulsing with a kind of dark potential. It was a key. But to what lock? My old laptop, a relic I hadn't opened in weeks, was on the desk. I fumbled with the power cord, my hands shaking, and waited an eternity for the machine to groan to life. The familiar startup chime sounded like a scream in the silence. I slid the flash drive into the USB port. A window popped up. A single folder. It was named HYDRA. My finger hovered over the trackpad. Every instinct for self-preservation, withered as it was, told me to stop. To throw this thing away. To walk out of this room and never look back. But where would I go? What was left to preserve? I thought of Michael's smirk, the casual way he'd tossed away 25 years of my life. I thought of my son's voice, cold and distant. I thought of the crushing weight of my own helplessness. I double-clicked. The folder opened into a maze of subfolders. Offshore transfers. Shell core. Project cleanse. Investor reports _draft versus final. It was the organizational structure of a secret life. My heart began to pound, a frantic, wild rhythm against my ribs. I clicked on the first file, a spreadsheet in the offshore transfers folder. A password prompt appeared. Of course. My brief surge of adrenaline crashed into a wall of frustration. It was a cruel prank. A locked box with no key. I tried everything I could think of: Michael's birthday, our anniversary, our children's names, the company name. Nothing. Access denied. Access denied. Access denied. I slumped back in the chair, the hollow feeling returning, deeper this time for having been briefly filled with a sliver of hope. It was over. I was about to slam the laptop shut when my eyes fell on the note again. Finish what he started. What had he started? My gaze drifted to the box. I picked it up, running my fingers along the inside, searching for anything, a hidden compartment, another note. Nothing. It was just a plain cardboard box. Defeated, I started to crush it in my hand, and that's when I felt it. A tiny bump, right under the folded-over inner lip of the cardboard. A small piece of tape, holding a tiny, folded slip of paper, almost perfectly camouflaged. My breath caught. I carefully peeled it free. It was no bigger than my thumbnail. I unfolded it. One word. Andromeda. A password. It had to be. I turned back to the laptop so fast the chair screeched against the floor. I pulled up the password prompt and typed, my fingers flying across the keys as if they had a will of their own. ANDROMEDA. I hit enter. The prompt vanished. The spreadsheet opened. And my world broke apart for the second time. It wasn't just a spreadsheet. It was a map of a criminal empire. Rows and columns of dates, routing numbers to banks in Switzerland and the Cayman Islands, and transfer amounts that made me dizzy. Millions. Tens of millions of dollars. And the dates, the transfers had accelerated over the past year, reaching a fever pitch during the 8 months Michael was sick. While I was selling my wedding ring for a few $100s to pay for his medication, he was moving $2 million to an untraceable account under the name of a shell corporation called Pegasus Holdings. The hypocrisy was so monstrous, so absolute, it defied comprehension. He hadn't let me sell our life because he needed the money. He'd watched me do it because it was convenient. It was part of his cover story. The brave cancer survivor, brought low, fighting for his life with the support of his devoted, sacrificial wife. It was all a performance, and I had been his unwitting co-star. I clicked through the other files, the password unlocking every single one. I saw the real investor reports, and the fake ones used to lure in new capital, their profits inflated by millions. I saw the invoices from his own shell companies, billing Hale Innovations for consulting services that never happened. I saw emails, written in coded corporate jargon, orchestrating the entire symphony of theft. And then I saw the folder labeled Project Cleanse. Inside were plans. A timeline for dissolving the shell corporations, moving the combined funds into a final, single account under a new name, and cutting all ties with a partner who was referred to only by the initial C. The final transfer was scheduled for 3 months from now. The notes suddenly made perfect, terrifying sense. Finish what he started. Michael had started a process of betrayal, cutting out his partner in crime. And that partner, C, had been left with nothing but the proof. They couldn't go to the authorities without implicating themselves. So they had come to me. They hadn't given me a key, they'd given me a weapon. They were pointing me at their shared enemy and telling me to pull the trigger. I leaned back, the cheap motel chair groaning under my weight. The sun was beginning to rise, casting a pale, gray light into the room. I hadn't slept. I wasn't tired. The exhaustion that had weighed me down for months was gone, burned away by a new energy. It was rage. A rage so pure and cold and clean it felt like sanity. He hadn't just left me. He had used my love as a shield while he committed grand larceny. He had made me a pawn in a game I didn't even know he was playing. He had called me worn out, unstable, a ghost. I looked at my reflection in the dark screen of the laptop. The woman staring back was no longer a victim. Her eyes were not hollow anymore. They were filled with a terrible, crystalline clarity. He thought he had erased me. He was wrong. He had just cleared the board for a new game. A game I was going to learn to play. Part 3, Forging the Ghost. The motel room, once my prison, became my crucible. The cracked ceiling transformed from a map of my despair into a canvas for my strategy. My first move was to sever the last tie to my old self. I walked to a gas station, bought a cheap prepaid phone, and then dropped my old smartphone into a public trash can. It was a symbolic act, a burial. Rebecca Hale, the heartbroken wife, was gone. In her place, a ghost was learning to walk. Paranoia became my guiding principle. The flash drive was a gift from an unknown, and likely dangerous, entity. Michael was powerful and connected. I was a novice moving against a king. I had to be invisible. My old, clunky laptop was a liability, a breadcrumb trail leading straight back to me. With the last of my cash, I bought 2 things, a used, nondescript laptop from a pawn shop 2 towns over, paying in cash, and a stack of public transit cards. I became a nomad in my own city. My office was no longer a single room, but a rotating network of anonymous spaces with free Wi-Fi, the fluorescent hum of a 24-hour laundromat, the corner booth of a greasy spoon diner at 4 a.m., the hushed, dusty aisles of the downtown public library. I never went to the same place 2 days in a row. I always sat with my back to a wall, the laptop screen angled away from view. I learned to live on cheap coffee and the adrenaline of the hunt. The first few weeks were an exercise in self-education. I plunged into the dark corners of the internet, my new digital homeland. I watched hours of tutorials on cybersecurity, my brain aching as I tried to absorb a new language of VPNs, proxy chains, and end-to-end encryption. I downloaded the Tor browser, a gateway to an anonymized internet where I could move without a shadow. I created a series of encrypted email accounts with providers based in Switzerland and Germany, each with a randomly generated password 20 characters long. Each email would be a single-use weapon, fired once and then deleted forever. The flash drive was my textbook. I didn't just look at the files, I dissected them. I bought notebooks and pens and spent nights cross-referencing every transfer, every doctored invoice, every coded email. I created a flowchart on my motel room wall, using cheap yarn to connect Michael's name to shell corporations, offshore accounts, and the key players mentioned in his emails. The wall became a sprawling, intricate web of his deceit, a monument to his greed. I learned the rhythm of his crime, the way money flowed from his legitimate business into the shadow financial system he'd built. During this time, I had to maintain my cover. The weekly calls to Jessica were the hardest part. I would use a payphone, my voice pitched to sound weary and broken. "How are you, Mom? Are you okay?" she'd ask, her voice laced with the guilt he had planted there. "I'm getting by, sweetie," I'd say, the lie a bitter pill. Just taking it one day at a time. While I spoke to her, my eyes would be scanning the street, my senses on high alert. I was living a dual life, the pathetic victim my family saw, and the digital predator I was becoming. After 2 months of relentless study, I was ready. I couldn't just dump the entire drive on the police or the press. An anonymous data dump would be treated with suspicion, easily dismissed by Michael's high-priced lawyers as a forgery, a corporate espionage attempt. No, this couldn't be a single explosion. It had to be death by 1,000 cuts. My strategy would be a campaign of curated leaks, each one designed to hit a different pressure point, creating a crisis so multifaceted he wouldn't know where to fight back. I identified my 3 targets. The IRS for tax evasion. The SEC for investor fraud. And for the court of public opinion, I needed a megaphone. I spent a week researching financial journalists. I found him in the archives of a small, independent investigative news site, Marcus Thorne. He was a pit bull, a reporter with a reputation for sinking his teeth into complex corporate fraud cases and never letting go. He wasn't at a major newspaper, which meant he was hungry and likely not susceptible to pressure from powerful advertisers or corporate boards. He was perfect. The first move was the most terrifying. From the library, hidden behind the anonymity of the Tor network, I composed my first email to Thorne. My username was a random string of 16 numbers. The subject line was simple, a loose thread at Hale Innovations. I kept the message brief, baiting the hook without revealing my hand. Look into the consulting fees paid to a Panamanian firm called Orion Ventures. The numbers don't add up. Ask yourself why a tech company needs to pay millions for vague, strategic services from an entity with no physical office or employees. This is just the start. If you're serious, I'll be in touch. I attached a single document, one fraudulent invoice from Hale Innovations to Orion Ventures for $750,000. Just enough to pique his interest and be verifiable through public records, but not enough to expose the whole operation. I hit send, and my heart hammered against my ribs so hard I felt dizzy. I had fired the first shot. The waiting was a unique form of torture. For 3 weeks, silence. I scoured Thorne's website daily, my hope dwindling with each passing day. The paranoia intensified. Had he ignored it? Worse, had he gone to Michael's people, trading the tip for a bigger story? I imagined black cars pulling up outside my motel, men in suits kicking down my door. I was about to scrub the entire operation, destroy the hard drive, and run, when his article appeared. The headline was cautious, but it was there. Hale Innovations faces scrutiny over opaque offshore payments. Thorne had done his homework. He'd confirmed Orion Ventures was a shell company and publicly questioned the legitimacy of the payments. It was a small story, buried on page 3 of the business section, but it was a beginning. He had taken the bait. Now, I began to orchestrate the Symphony. A week later, Thorne received a second anonymous email from a new, different encrypted account. This one contained the full ledger for Orion Ventures, detailing years of fraudulent payments. The same day, I crafted a different package of information. I compiled all the evidence of tax evasion, the siphon profits, the undeclared offshore interest, and submitted it through the IRS's official whistleblower tip portal, a secure, anonymous system designed for exactly this. Then, I assembled a third package, the draft versus final investor reports, clearly showing the fraud. This went to the SEC's tip line. I was seeding the ground in 3 separate fields, knowing that eventually, the harvests would ripen at the same time. The close calls kept me sharp. One afternoon, sitting in a coffee shop, I was so engrossed in tracing a transaction that I failed to notice a man in a suit sit down at the table behind me. He was on his phone, and I overheard him say, "No, I'm telling you, the mood at Hale is grim. Ever since that Thorne article." I froze. My blood turned to ice. I shut the laptop, paid for my coffee in cash, and walked out without looking back, my body rigid. I spent the next 2 days in my room, not daring to go online, convinced I had been compromised. But the silence held. It had just been a random employee. The city was smaller than I thought. The incident taught me a valuable lesson: I could never get comfortable. I could never let my guard down. For 6 months, I continued the campaign, a ghost feeding scraps to the wolves. Each leak was more damaging than the last. I sent Thorne emails between Michael and his bankers. I sent the regulators proof of him using corporate funds to pay the lease on a luxury apartment for his new girlfriend, a 20-something yoga instructor whose picture I'd seen on Jessica's social media. I was a phantom, an unseen force of chaos in his perfectly ordered world. And then, the first real domino fell. The SEC, armed with my evidence, formally announced it was launching an investigation into Hale Innovations for securities fraud. The story wasn't on page 3 anymore. It was the headline on every major financial news network. I watched it on the small TV in my motel room. I saw Michael, flanked by lawyers, standing in front of his gleaming office building. He looked indignant, defiant, reading from a prepared statement about baseless allegations from shadowy sources. But I could see past the bravado. I saw the flicker of panic in his eyes, the slight tremble in his hand as he held the paper. He was a king under siege, and he had no idea that the enemy wasn't at his gates. She was in a cheap motel room across town, watching him on a 19-inch screen, holding the blueprints to his entire kingdom in her hands. The foundation was cracked. Now, it was time to bring the whole damned building down. Part 4, The Symphony of Ashes. The public unraveling was swifter and more brutal than I had ever anticipated. The SEC investigation was the first crack in the dam, and suddenly, a flood of scrutiny, fear, and betrayal burst through. Marcus Thorne, now vindicated and fueled by my steady, untraceable drip of evidence, became a media sensation. He published a new, devastating article every week, each one exposing another layer of Michael's criminal enterprise. He gave the shell corporations their mythical names: Pegasus, Orion, Cassiopeia, turning Michael's scheme into a sordid, modern fable of greed. I watched from the shadows as Michael's world burned. The news was my theater, the motel room my private viewing box. His carefully constructed image of a brilliant, resilient survivor was incinerated in the court of public opinion. He became a caricature of corporate avarice. His initial defiance on television melted away with each new revelation. The angry, confident CEO was replaced by a haunted, gaunt figure, his expensive suits hanging loosely on a frame shrinking with stress. The dark circles under his eyes were a mirror of the ones I'd worn while nursing him back to health. The irony was exquisite. The most complex part of my victory was watching its impact on our children. One evening, a local news channel ran a segment, and I saw Mark. A reporter had ambushed him outside his office. He was just 24, and the shame and confusion were written all over his face. "My father is a good man," he stammered, his voice cracking as he shielded his face from the camera. "These are lies. Someone is trying to destroy him." A part of me ached for the boy I'd raised, now forced to defend a monster. But a colder, harder part of me knew this was necessary. The myth had to be destroyed before the man could be seen. Jessica's call came late one night. She was sobbing, her words tumbling out in a torrent of pain. Mom, is it true? Any of it? Dad says it's a conspiracy, that you might even be involved. He said you were unstable enough to do something like this. For a moment, the sheer audacity of his manipulation stole my breath. Even now, with his world on fire, he was still trying to use me as a shield. I kept my voice a calm, steady anchor in her storm. Jessica, I said softly, the words chosen with surgical care. Your father built his life on stories. Maybe it's time to start asking which ones were true. It was the closest I would ever come to a confession. The corporate death spiral accelerated. The IRS, acting on my now months-old tip, froze his personal and corporate accounts. Key executives, seeing the writing on the wall, began to cooperate with investigators to save themselves, confirming the authenticity of the documents Thorne had been publishing. Within 8 months of the first article, Hale Innovations, Michael's life's work, filed for bankruptcy, its name now synonymous with fraud. 2 weeks later, the final act of the public humiliation played out. I was in the back of a city bus, watching a live news feed on my burner laptop, when the alert flashed. Federal agents had raided Michael's luxury apartment. The helicopter footage was grainy, but the image was perfectly clear. They led him out in handcuffs. He wasn't wearing an expensive suit, he was in a simple gray tracksuit. His shoulders were slumped, his face ashen and empty. He looked up for a moment, his eyes scanning the chaos of cameras and reporters, and there was nothing left in them. No anger, no defiance. Just the hollowed-out void of a man whose story had finally ended. The smirk was gone. Forever. His trial was a formality. His partners, the ones he hadn't managed to cut out in Project Cleanse, turned on him for lighter sentences. The mountain of evidence I had provided made his conviction inevitable. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in federal prison, citing his staggering lack of remorse and the calculated cruelty of his deception. I read the news in the quiet of the public library. 15 years. All his assets were seized. He had nothing. He was nothing. The fire of vengeance that had burned in me for so long, the cold, meticulous rage that had been my fuel, finally subsided. It didn't leave a void as I had expected. It left peace. A profound, echoing silence in my soul where the storm had been. 1 year to the day after he had handed me divorce papers, the final echo of the storm arrived. The same quiet knock. The same plain cardboard box on my motel doorstep. My hands were steady as I opened it. Inside, there was no flash drive. Just a single piece of that same heavy, crisp cardstock. 2 typed words. Debt settled. It was a sign-off from my ghostly benefactor. An acknowledgement. A closing of the books. Our shared enemy was gone. I took the note, and the first one I had ever received, to the rusty barbecue pit behind the motel. As dusk settled, I lit them with a cheap lighter and watched them burn. I watched the words that had started it all, finish what he started, curl into black ash and float away into the evening sky. The next morning, I packed my single bag. I walked to the front desk, left the key on the counter, and stepped out into the bright morning sun. I had enough money to buy a bus ticket to a city where no one knew my name. I didn't know where I was going, but for the first time in my life, it didn't matter. As I walked toward the bus station, a strange feeling bloomed in my chest. I felt my lips curve into a small, quiet smile. It was the first real smile in years. Michael had tried to erase me, to reduce my life to a tragic footnote in his story. But in the end, his story was over, a cautionary tale of greed and hubris. Mine was just beginning. I hadn't gotten my old life back. I had been given something far more valuable, a new one, forged in fire, and built by my own 2 hands. They say revenge is a dish best served cold. They're wrong. Revenge isn't a dish at all. It's a fire. A fire that can either consume you or cleanse you. For me, it was a forge. It melted me down into my essential components and hammered me back into something new. Something stronger. I didn't get my old life back, but I didn't want it. That life was a beautiful lie. The truth, my truth, is that I'm still here. I'm the architect of my own second chance, and this time, I'm building it on a foundation of solid rock. What Michael did was more than betrayal, it was an attempt to annihilate a person's soul. My story is about taking that fire and aiming it back at the one who lit the match. So, I have to ask you, was what I did justice? Or was it something else entirely? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you believe that the forgotten and the underestimated deserve to have their stories told, please consider liking and subscribing. Thank you for listening.